A child could be born into the Tudor court with noble blood in her veins and still have no place in the family that created her. She might grow up surrounded by whispers, careful glances, and decisions made quietly behind closed doors. Some were hidden in distant households, some guided toward convent walls, and some simply disappeared from the records that preserved noble names. Their lives unfolded beside power, yet rarely within it. Tonight, we step into the quiet world of the daughters that Tudor society tried not to remember. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If a visitor stood quietly along the walls of a Tudor court hall, the first thing they might notice would not be the king or the nobles, but the careful order in which everyone existed. Titles, marriages, and family names quietly arranged every life into its proper place. Rank could be read in clothing, in posture, in where a person was allowed to stand. Even before anyone spoke, the court already knew who belonged at the centre of power and who remained on its edges. The Tudor world was built upon lineage, blood-determined opportunity, safety, and reputation. A child born within a recognized marriage carried a clear identity from the moment of baptism. Their name connected them to land, alliance, and expectations that stretched across generations. Family trees were recorded with care, and marriages were negotiated like contracts meant to preserve that stability. A child born outside such arrangements entered the world differently. Their blood might be noble, but the absence of legal marriage placed them in a quiet uncertainty. In official records, they might appear only briefly, sometimes without a surname that clearly tied them to a father. Their existence was not entirely hidden, yet it was rarely celebrated. For boys, this uncertainty could occasionally be softened. A powerful father might recognize a son quietly, arranging education or positions that gave him a place in society. Sons could be trained for military service, administration, or church careers. Their usefulness made it easier for families to overlook the circumstances of their birth. For daughters, the situation was far less forgiving. A girl's future in Tudor society was closely tied to marriage, and marriage depended on reputation. Families arranging alliances examined lineage carefully. They wanted proof of legitimacy, proof that the woman joining their household carried no shadow over her name. A girl born to a mistress began life without that protection. Even when her father held influence, her position remained delicate. The court rarely spoke openly about such children, yet everyone seemed to know. Servants whispered in corridors. Ladies exchanged quiet glances during gatherings, and rumors traveled through the palace faster than official announcements. The importance placed on female honor made these whispers powerful. A woman's reputation in Tudor society was treated almost like a fragile object that could be damaged with very little effort. If doubt appeared around her birth, that doubt could follow her for the rest of her life. In many cases, the mother's situation made matters even more complicated. A mistress existed in a strange position within court life. She could enjoy luxury, attention, and influence for a time. Yet none of those advantages came with legal security. Her status depended entirely on the favor of the man connected to her. If that favor faded, the comforts surrounding her could disappear with surprising speed. Gifts, apartments, and financial allowances were never guaranteed forever. When the relationship ended, the woman often had to think carefully about how to protect her child from the consequences. Some mothers tried to move their daughters away from the court environment as early as possible. They arranged for relatives to raise the child in quieter households where the gossip of the palace would not reach so easily. Distance could soften rumors, though it rarely erased them. Others sought financial support from the father. This support might appear as a small pension or a modest property meant to provide stability. These arrangements were often discreet, written in documents that avoided drawing unnecessary attention. Despite these efforts, the court never truly forgot such stories. Tudor society functioned through observation. Every gathering, every feast, every ceremony brought people together in ways that encouraged comparison. Families studied one another constantly, measuring rank, connections, and reputation. A child whose origins raised questions became part of that quiet scrutiny. Nothing dramatic needed to happen. No public accusation was required. The simple awareness that she existed outside legal marriage was enough to influence how people treated her. This cautious attitude shaped how opportunities appeared in her life. Invitations might be fewer. Education could be limited. Marriage negotiations often avoided her entirely, especially among the most ambitious families who guarded their reputations carefully. Even kindness towards such children sometimes carried calculation. A noble woman might show generosity toward a girl whose birth was uncertain, offering assistance or mentorship. Yet that generosity often remained controlled and distant, ensuring that sympathy never became associated with scandal. In this environment, legitimacy functioned almost like a passport. Without it, every step required greater caution. Doors were not always locked, but they rarely opened easily. Looking back, the strictness of this system can feel unsettling. It is strange to imagine that the circumstances of a birth could quietly determine so many aspects of a person's life before they even learned to speak. Yet within Tudor society, this logic seemed perfectly ordinary. People believed that order depended on clear lines of inheritance. Property, power, and titles moved through families in carefully organized patterns. Legitimacy protected those patterns. Anything outside them appeared dangerous, not only to families, but to the broader stability of society. Because of this belief, even small deviations from the accepted structure attracted attention. A mistress's daughter represented one of those deviations. Her presence reminded the court that human relationships did not always obey legal boundaries. For the girl herself, none of these discussions would be visible in early childhood. She would grow up surrounded by ordinary routines, unaware of the calculations happening quietly around her. Adults would speak politely, servants would perform their duties, and daily life would continue with calm appearances. Yet beneath those appearances, decisions about her future might already be forming. Conversations held in private rooms could determine where she would live, who would educate her, and what paths would remain closed long before she was old enough to understand them. The Tudor court believed that blood and legitimacy kept society orderly and secure. Yet a single child born outside marriage could quietly disturb that careful arrangement. And somewhere within the court's silent calculations, people had already begun deciding how far that disturbance would be allowed to reach. Life as a mistress in the Tudor court existed in a strange space between privilege and uncertainty. A woman in this position could live surrounded by comfort for a time. She might receive fine clothing, private apartments, and invitations to gatherings where music and conversation lasted late into the evening. From a distance, her life could appear almost identical to that of the noble ladies who moved confidently through the halls of the palace. Yet beneath this appearance rested a fragile reality that everyone quietly understood. The most important difference was the absence of marriage. Without a formal union recognized by the church and law, the relationship had no permanent protection. A wife possessed documents, witnesses, and family alliances that secured her position. A mistress had none of these. Her place in the court depended entirely on the continuing interest of the man who favored her. This dependence created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. Favor in the Tudor court could change quickly. A king or nobleman might lose interest, become distracted by politics, or turn his attention to another woman. When this happened, The consequences for a mistress could be immediate. The comfortable rooms might no longer be available. Financial support could shrink or disappear altogether. Servants who once treated her with respect might suddenly become distant. For the woman herself, this instability was difficult enough. For a child born within such a relationship, the situation became even more complicated. A daughter entering the world under these circumstances carried a quiet vulnerability from the very beginning of her life. The father might acknowledge the child privately, offering money or arranging a household where she could be raised safely. Such gestures could provide temporary security, but they rarely solved the deeper problem. Without a legal marriage linking her parents, the child's place within the social order remained uncertain. Court society was highly observant. People watched carefully for signs of influence and legitimacy. When a mistress gave birth to a daughter, the event rarely passed unnoticed. Even if the court avoided speaking openly about it, the information travelled quickly through servants, attendants, and relatives connected to the household. This quiet circulation of knowledge shaped how the child would be viewed. She might grow up surrounded by care, but she would also grow up surrounded by caution. Invitations to certain social circles might never arrive. Families planning marriages for their sons could hesitate when their origins became known. The mother understood these dangers very clearly. Many mistresses spent considerable effort trying to secure some form of protection for their children. They might persuade the father to provide a financial allowance or a small estate that would ensure stability later in life. In other cases, they arranged for the child to be raised outside the court, where daily gossip would be less intense. Even with these precautions, the future remained unpredictable. If the father's affection weakened, the arrangements supporting the child could also weaken. A pension might stop. A guardian might withdraw assistance. The security that once seemed reliable could fade quietly. Looking back, it is unsettling to realize how much I depended on personal favor rather than law. A single relationship could determine whether a child lived comfortably or struggled for recognition. The rules of the court were written clearly for wives and legitimate heirs, yet they remained vague and uncertain for everyone else. This uncertainty was particularly difficult for daughters. In Tudor society, a girl's future often depended on marriage into another respectable household. Marriage negotiations required confidence in family reputation. When that reputation carried even a faint shadow of scandal, many families preferred to look elsewhere. Because of this, the life of a mistress created a quiet tension that extended far beyond her own experience. Her fortunes rose and fell with the attention of the man who favoured her. But the consequences also touched the children connected to her. A daughter could inherit the comfort of her mother's brief success, yet she could just as easily inherit the uncertainty that came with it. A mistress in the Tudor court lived within comfort that could disappear without warning. Her daughter grew up beneath the same fragile protection, surrounded by kindness that depended entirely on favour. And in the quiet calculations of the court, people were already considering what should be done with such a child. The birth of a child inside the Tudor court rarely remained private for long. Palaces were crowded places filled with servants, attendants, messengers, and visitors who moved constantly through corridors and courtyards. News travelled quickly in such environments, sometimes reaching distant rooms before official announcements were even prepared. When a woman connected to a powerful man gave birth quietly, the event often became known through whispers long before any ceremony confirmed it. In cases involving a mistress, the arrival of a daughter carried a particular tension. The child might be born in comfortable surroundings, perhaps within a townhouse, arranged by the father, or in a residence belonging to one of the mother's supporters. The rooms could be clean, attended by midwives and servants, and the birth itself might pass without serious difficulty. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the event was rarely relaxed. Those present understood that the news would not remain contained within those walls. Servants delivering linens, physicians leaving the house, and neighbours observing unusual movement at the doors all became quiet carriers of information. A single remark overheard in a kitchen could travel through an entire district by evening. Rumours often spread before the child even received a name. By the time preparations began for the baptism, many people connected to the court had already heard that a girl had been born to a woman whose position was uncertain. Details varied from telling to telling, but the central fact rarely disappeared. Within Tudor society, baptism was more than a religious ritual. It served as a public acknowledgement of a child's place in the community. Witnesses gathered, names were recorded, and the presence of respected godparents helped shape the child's future reputation. For a daughter born outside formal marriage, arranging this ceremony required careful thought. Some mothers attempted to manage the situation quietly. They might organize a small baptism, attended only by trusted relatives and a few loyal servants. By limiting the number of witnesses, they hoped to reduce attention and keep the story from growing larger than necessary. Others pursued a different strategy. Instead of hiding the child entirely, they sought ways to make her presence appear less controversial. A powerful father might provide financial support openly enough for people to understand that the child would not be abandoned. In certain cases, he even ensured that respected individuals served as godparents, thereby lending the ceremony a degree of legitimacy. These gestures did not erase the circumstances of the birth, but they could soften how the court responded. Reputation in Tudor society often depended on perception. If influential figures treated the child with a measure of respect, others sometimes followed that example. Despite these efforts, memory within noble circles remained long and precise. Aristocratic families valued lineage deeply, and they paid close attention to the origins of everyone who moved within their social world. A girl, born under uncertain circumstances, might be accepted politely in daily life. Yet her story was rarely forgotten. Genealogies were recorded carefully by families proud of their heritage. Marriage negotiations required detailed knowledge of relatives, to alliances, and past reputations. When names were discussed around tables or written in family records, the circumstances of birth could quietly appear beside them. Because of this habit of careful remembrance, the identity of a mistress's daughter rarely disappeared completely. Even if the child grew up far from the palace, the knowledge of her origins could resurface years later, when questions about her background became important. For the mother, this awareness created constant concern. She understood that a daughter's future might depend on how successfully those early rumors were managed. The difference between a quiet acknowledgement and a widely repeated scandal could influence the opportunities available to the child when she reached adulthood. Many mothers, therefore, devoted significant effort to controlling information during the first months of the child's life. They chose carefully which servants remained in the household. Letters were written cautiously, sometimes avoiding direct references to the child's father. Visitors were limited, and conversations about the birth were handled with restraint. Even with such precautions, secrecy rarely lasted forever. Tudor society operated through networks of observation that reached far beyond official announcements. Courtiers, merchants, and distant relatives all formed part of an informal system that collected and exchanged information about births, marriages, and deaths. Looking back, it is striking how early a child could become part of these quiet calculations. A girl still sleeping in a cradle might already be the subject of discussion among people who had never met her. Her future reputation could begin forming long before she was capable of understanding the world around her. This reality reflected the deeper priorities of Tudor society. Lineage shaped expectations about inheritance, alliance, and loyalty. A child connected to a powerful man always attracted attention, even when the connection remained unofficial. Within this environment, the birth of a mistress's daughter existed somewhere between recognition and silence. The event was rarely celebrated openly, yet it was seldom ignored. The court observed, remembered, and waited to see how the story would develop. A daughter born in secrecy entered the world already surrounded by rumour and careful observation. The baptism might quiet the immediate whispers. Yet the memory of her origins rarely faded from noble circles. In time, those quiet observations would begin to affect how every glance, every invitation, and every opportunity was given or withheld. Within the Tudor court, resemblance rarely passed unnoticed. Palaces were crowded environments where observation became almost a habit. Servants watched their masters. Courtiers watched one another, and families quietly compared every new face that appeared among them. When a child entered this world without a formal name tying her to a powerful father, attention often focused not on what was written in records, but on what could be seen in her features. A girl might carry her mother's surname, or be introduced simply as a relative under protection. On paper, nothing connected her openly to the man who had fathered her. Yet faces have a way of revealing truths that documents attempt to hide. A similar curve of the mouth, the same colour of hair, or the familiar shape of the eyes could begin conversations long before anyone spoke aloud. Such comparisons rarely happened openly. Tudor society valued careful manners, especially in matters that touched powerful families. Instead of direct statements, people relied on subtle observation. A glance exchanged between ladies at a feast could carry meaning. A servant might remark quietly that the child resembled someone important. These comments spread slowly through corridors, kitchens, and gardens. Court life created the perfect environment for this kind of quiet speculation. Large households required many attendants, and each attendant formed part of an informal network that carried information from one corner of the palace to another. By the time a child appeared again at the next gathering, many people already believed they understood who she resembled. The girl herself might remain unaware of these comparisons. A child's world was small, shaped mostly by her nurse, her mother, and the rooms where she spent her days. She could walk through halls decorated with tapestries and portraits without realizing that those portraits might resemble her more than she understood. As she grew older and began appearing more frequently in public spaces, the resemblance often became harder for others to ignore. Children did not yet understand the careful expressions adults use to hide their thoughts. A girl might laugh loudly or run across a courtyard without noticing the silent attention that followed her movements. For those observing the court, every appearance offered another chance to study her face. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet amusement, and a few with discomfort. In a society that valued legitimate lineage, an unofficial child who resembled a powerful man could become an uncomfortable reminder of a private relationship. The father himself might attempt to treat the situation carefully. Kindness toward the girl could appear in small gestures. Financial support might ensure she lived comfortably. Servants could be assigned to her household, and gifts might arrive during certain holidays. These actions suggested responsibility without requiring public acknowledgement. Yet even these gestures carried risks. Too much attention toward the child might encourage gossip. Too little might appear cruel. Balancing these possibilities required careful judgment, especially when the man already had a legal wife and legitimate children. The position of the wife made the situation even more sensitive. As the recognized partner within the marriage, she represented stability and lawful inheritance. Her children stood first in the line of family expectation. The appearance of another child who visibly resembled her husband introduced a quiet complication into that arrangement. Many noble women responded to such situations with measured restraint. Open anger would draw attention and create a scandal. Instead, responses often appeared through subtle decisions. A girl might not be invited to certain gatherings. Her visits to the main household might remain limited. These actions allowed the wife to protect her family's position without public confrontation. People surrounding the family quickly recognized these signals. In the Tudor court, behavior often spoke more clearly than words. If a noblewoman chose distance toward a particular child, others tended to follow her example. Over time, the child's presence could begin to create a sense of unease within certain circles. No one needed to accuse anyone of anything directly. The resemblance itself carried enough meaning. Each glance at the girl's face quietly reminded the court of a relationship that had never been meant to stand in the open. Looking back, it is striking how strongly appearance could influence perception. Modern observers might rely on documents or official statements to confirm a connection between people. In the Tudor court, physical resemblance alone could shape belief. A familiar expression or gesture sometimes carried more weight than written proof. For the child, however, these adult concerns remained invisible. She experienced the court simply as the environment where she lived. Servants brought her meals. Attendants guided her through corridors. And adults occasionally smiled at her with polite curiosity. Yet behind those polite expressions, judgments had already begun forming. The girl might never carry her father's name, but many people had already decided whose blood she carried. And once those conclusions settled into the memory of the court, they rarely disappeared. Resemblance had revealed more than any official record ever would. Courtiers continued watching quietly, measuring every feature against the man they believed to be her father. Somewhere within the careful calculations of the household, the girl's presence was beginning to feel less like a secret and more like a problem waiting for a solution. In Tudor society, the value of a child was often measured not only by birth, but by usefulness within the political structure of the family. Households did not simply raise children out of affection. They raised heirs, alliances, and instruments that could strengthen a family's influence. Within this system, sons and daughters rarely carried equal expectations. A boy born into a powerful household immediately represented potential. Even if his birth occurred outside a legal marriage, a son could still become valuable. Fathers might educate him, provide land, or guide him toward careers in the military, administration, or the church. These paths allowed men to turn ability and loyalty into authority. In many cases, unofficial sons were acknowledged quietly if they proved capable. A powerful father might arrange positions that gave the boy status without openly disrupting legitimate inheritance. The court understood such arrangements and often tolerated them as long as they did not threaten the primary line of succession. Because of this, a boy born to a mistress sometimes had opportunities that a daughter in the same position rarely received. Society was willing to forgive uncertainty in a son's birth if the son could serve the ambitions of the family. For daughters, the calculation worked differently. A girl's role within Tudor aristocratic culture depended heavily on marriage. Marriage connected families, transferred property, and created alliances that shaped the balance of power among noble houses. Because these arrangements involved reputation as much as wealth, legitimacy became extremely important. Families seeking brides for their sons examined lineage carefully. They wanted assurance that the woman joining their household came from a background free of scandal. Even a small doubt surrounding a girl's birth could make negotiations difficult. When a daughter was known to be the child of a mistress, that doubt rarely disappeared. This difference in opportunity created a quiet imbalance from the beginning of a child's life. A boy might be educated with the expectation that he would eventually find a role within the political or administrative world. A girl without clear legitimacy often received far less investment in her future. Education for such girls could remain basic and practical. They might learn reading, household management, and religious instruction, but rarely the social training required to represent a powerful household. Without that preparation, entering influential marriages became even less likely. The court recognized these limitations and adjusted its expectations accordingly. When conversations about inheritance or alliances occurred, sons usually remained at the center of attention. Daughters whose birth raised questions gradually drifted toward the edges of these discussions. This shift rarely happened suddenly. Instead, it unfolded through small decisions. Invitations might favor legitimate children. Tutors might devote more attention to boys expected to carry the family name. Resources that could support a daughter's future marriage might be directed elsewhere. From the outside, The change might appear subtle. A girl could still live comfortably within a household and receive polite treatment from those around her. Yet, the long-term plans shaping the family's future rarely included her in the same way they included legitimate heirs. Looking back, it is unsettling to recognize how clearly these priorities shaped daily life. Modern readers often imagine childhood as a period protected from adult calculations. Tudor society rarely allowed such separation. Even very young children existed within a system that measured their future usefulness. For a daughter born to a mistress, the consequences were especially visible as she grew older. While sons might step gradually toward careers and responsibilities, she often found herself moving away from the center of family attention. Conversations about alliances rarely involved her name. Some families attempted to soften this reality through financial support or protective arrangements. A girl might receive a modest dowry or be placed under the guidance of relatives willing to supervise her upbringing. These solutions provided stability, but rarely restored the influence she might have possessed under different circumstances. In many households, the unspoken solution was distance. Removing the girl from the center of court life allowed families to preserve their reputation while avoiding open conflict. Living elsewhere also reduced the daily reminders of a complicated relationship that many preferred to forget. This quiet movement away from power shaped the direction of many lives. A daughter, born under uncertain circumstances, might spend her early childhood near the court, surrounded by glimpses of privilege. Yet as time passed, the paths available to her narrowed. What remained was a gradual realization that her future would not resemble that of the legitimate daughters whose marriages and alliances shaped noble history. Within the Tudor court, sons often remained valuable, even when their birth raised questions. Daughters in the same situation rarely received the same patience or opportunity. And as families continued planning their futures, many of those daughters were slowly guided away from the center of power. Life for a mistress in the Tudor world rarely allowed long periods of security. Comfort could appear suddenly through gifts, apartments, and generous attention from a powerful man. But none of those advantages promised permanence. Women who lived within this uncertain arrangement often understood that their circumstances could change quickly. When a daughter was involved, that awareness became even stronger. A mother in such a position usually spends considerable time thinking about the future of her child. The girl might still be young, perhaps only beginning to walk through the corridors of the household. Yet the decisions shaping her life often needed to be made early. Reputation, protection, and financial stability could not be left to chance. One of the first concerns involved financial support. Without a formal marriage linking the parents, the child had no automatic claim to inheritance. A mother, therefore, needed to persuade the father to provide something that would remain after the relationship itself faded. This support often appeared in modest forms. A small annual allowance might be arranged, delivered quietly through trusted agents. In other cases, a piece of land or a minor property could be granted in the child's name. Such estates were rarely impressive. Yet even a small parcel of land provided income and a sense of security. These arrangements were usually handled carefully to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Legal documents might refer to guardians or distant relatives rather than openly naming the father. The goal was not public recognition, but stability that could survive the changing moods of the court. At the same time, many mothers understood that distance from court life could offer additional protection. The palace was filled with observation and gossip. Every appearance of a child connected to a controversial relationship invited new speculation. Removing the girl from that environment allowed her to grow up without constant scrutiny. Relatives often played an important role in this strategy. A trusted sister, cousin, or aunt might agree to raise the child within their household. Such arrangements allowed the girl to live in respectable surroundings, where her origins were less visible to the wider court. In these homes, the child could receive a quieter upbringing. Daily life revolved around routine rather than court ceremony. She might learn reading, household management, and religious instruction alongside other children. Without the pressure of palace attention, her early years could appear relatively ordinary. For the mother, however, these decisions rarely came easily. Sending a daughter away meant accepting long periods of separation. Visits might become infrequent, limited by distance and the need to avoid drawing attention to the child's true parentage. Letters replaced the daily presence that many mothers wished they could maintain. Even with these sacrifices, the effort often continued into later stages of the child's life. As the girl approached adolescence, questions about her future became more urgent. In Tudor society, marriage remained the primary path towards stability for women. Securing a respectable match, therefore, became another important objective. Because of the uncertainties surrounding the girl's birth, these negotiations usually required discretion. Instead of seeking ambitious alliances with powerful families, mothers often looked for quieter arrangements. A minor gentleman, a distant relative, or a respectable household outside the center of political life might offer suitable possibilities. These marriages rarely attracted attention within the court. They were organized privately, sometimes far from the places where rumors had first begun. The intention was not to elevate the girl into high political circles, but to provide her with a stable household where questions about her birth would matter less. Looking back, it becomes clear how much effort mothers invested in these quiet strategies. Every request for financial assistance, every decision to send a child to relatives, and every discreet negotiation for marriage represented an attempt to secure a future that the court itself might never openly support. In many ways, these actions reveal a different side of Tudor life. Behind the public ceremonies and elaborate displays of power existed countless private negotiations aimed simply at protecting children from the consequences of adult relationships. For the daughters involved, the results varied. Some grew up in peaceful households far from the palace that had once surrounded their mothers. Others continued to face reminders of their uncertain origins. Yet all of them owed their stability, however limited, to the careful planning of mothers who understood the fragile nature of their own position. Mistresses in the Tudor court rarely possessed legal power, yet many used quiet negotiation to protect their children. Small estates, distant households, and discreet marriages became tools for securing fragile stability. Even with these efforts, however, the shadow of the mother's reputation continued to linger over the daughter's future. Reputation in Tudor society functioned almost like a permanent record that followed a person wherever they went. Families guarded their honor carefully because it influenced alliances, marriages, and political trust. Once a story attached itself to a household, that story rarely disappeared completely. For a woman who had lived publicly as a mistress, the reputation created by that relationship often extended far beyond her own life. A daughter growing up under these circumstances inherited that reputation whether she wished to or not. Even when she had done nothing wrong, people around her remembered the circumstances of her birth. Conversations about her future, therefore, carried an additional layer of caution. The Tudor court valued appearance almost as much as truth. A family might behave politely toward the girl, inviting her to certain gatherings and offering basic kindness. Yet the memory of her mother's past remained present in quiet ways. Courtiers often avoided discussing such matters openly, but the knowledge lingered in subtle gestures and careful decisions. Among the nobility, marriage negotiations revealed this influence most clearly. When families began considering possible matches for their sons, they examined lineage with great attention. Names, relatives, and alliances were all studied in detail. A girl connected to a scandal through her mother's reputation inevitably raised questions. These questions did not always appear in direct accusations. Instead, they often emerged through hesitation. A family might delay responding to a proposal. They might request additional information about relatives, Sometimes they simply turned their attention toward another potential bride whose background appeared less complicated. From the outside, these refusals could appear polite and reasonable. Within the private discussions of noble households, however, the reason often remained clear. A daughter born to a mistress carried uncertainty that many families preferred to avoid. This situation created a frustrating contradiction for the girl herself. She might possess good manners, education, and personal qualities that made her a suitable partner in every practical sense. Yet the reputation connected to her mother could overshadow those advantages. In Tudor culture, a woman's honor was closely linked to ideas about purity and obedience. A mother who had lived openly as a mistress challenged those ideals. Even if the relationship had occurred under the protection of a powerful man, the daughter, therefore, became a visible reminder of that challenge. People sometimes treated the girl as a symbol rather than as an individual. Instead of evaluating her character, they saw her as evidence of a past scandal. The story surrounding her birth shaped how others interpreted her presence in social gatherings. This perception could influence even small aspects of daily life. Invitations to important events might be limited. Families cautious about their reputation sometimes preferred not to place their sons in situations where gossip might revive old stories. As a result, the girl often found herself moving within smaller social circles. Looking back, it is striking how strongly collective memory functioned in such communities. Tudor society lacked modern systems of record-keeping or widespread printed information. Yet people remembered personal histories with remarkable persistence. Stories passed quietly from one generation to another, carried through family conversations and local networks. Because of this habit of remembrance, the mother's reputation rarely faded completely, even when years passed, and the original relationship had ended. The details remained part of how people described the daughter's background. For the mother, this realization could be deeply troubling. Many women who had once enjoyed attention within the court eventually recognized that their past might limit their child's future. They had lived within a system where affection and power mixed freely. But their daughters faced the consequences of those choices in a different way. Some mothers attempted to counter this reputation by emphasizing education and proper conduct. They encouraged their daughters to behave with restraint, hoping that dignity and intelligence might outweigh suspicion. Others focused on securing financial stability that could compensate for a damaged reputation during marriage negotiations. Even with these efforts, the court often continued to view the daughter through the lens of her mother's history. Once a story became attached to a family name, removing it proved extremely difficult. Modern readers might find this harsh or unfair. Yet within Tudor culture, such judgments appeared logical. Society believed that family reputation reflected deeper moral character. If one member of a household had challenged social expectations, people assumed that influence might extend to others. The daughter, therefore, carried a burden that had formed long before she could understand it. Every introduction, every conversation about marriage, and every social gathering contained echoes of the past. The girl might attempt to build her own identity, but the court rarely allowed her to separate from the story surrounding her birth. In time, many families concluded that distance offered the simplest solution. Moving the daughter away from the center of court, life reduced the chance of scandal and allowed respectable households to continue their alliances without uncomfortable reminders. This gradual distancing did not necessarily involve cruelty. Often, it appeared as polite practicality, framed as an effort to secure a quieter and more stable future. Yet the result remained the same. The girl slowly disappeared from the political and social spaces where reputation mattered most. A mistress's reputation rarely ended with her own life, and the memory of it followed her daughter into adulthood. Marriage negotiations, invitations, and alliances were all shaped by the shadow of that past. Over time, the girl herself began to represent the scandal people preferred not to remember. Childhood within noble households of Tudor England rarely unfolded in complete isolation. even when a girl lived away from the central court. She still existed inside a network of families who knew one another well. Visits between households, shared tutors, and religious gatherings regularly brought children of similar rank together. These meetings created early friendships, but they also allowed the quiet judgments of adults to shape how those friendships developed. A daughter whose origins were uncertain often experienced this difference gradually. At first, the signs appeared subtle. Other children might hesitate before inviting her into games. Conversations sometimes paused when she approached. Nothing was said directly. Yet the atmosphere around her could feel slightly different from the easy confidence enjoyed by others. Children often absorbed the attitudes of the adults around them. Noble mothers and fathers spoke carefully about reputation inside their homes. Even when they avoided discussing scandal openly, their caution influenced how their children behaved toward those whose backgrounds raised questions. For a young girl growing up in this environment, the consequences could appear in everyday moments. A gathering arranged for lessons or music might include several families. Yet she could notice that certain mothers watched her with quiet attention. Their expressions remained polite, but their curiosity carried an unmistakable weight. Among noble women, protecting family reputation formed a constant responsibility. Mothers believed that the character and associations of their children would shape future alliances, because marriage negotiations began informally long before adulthood. They observed the social behavior of other families carefully. When a girl known to be the daughter of a mistress entered such gatherings, that careful observation often intensified. Noble mothers might not speak directly about their concerns, but they rarely forget the circumstances surrounding the child's birth. Their caution appeared in small decisions about who spent time with whom. Play among children reflected these quiet calculations. Friendships were still formed, yet they sometimes developed boundaries that the girl could sense without fully understanding. Invitations to visit certain households might remain limited. Participation in particular activities could feel uncertain. From the perspective of adults, these decisions appeared practical. Families wished to avoid unnecessary gossip or speculation about their associations. Allowing close friendships between their daughters and a girl connected to a scandal might invite questions they preferred to avoid. Looking back, it is unsettling to realize how early social caution could enter a child's life. Modern observers often imagine childhood friendships as simple and spontaneous. In Tudor, noble society, however, even children existed within structures shaped by reputation and family strategy. The girl herself might struggle to understand why certain relationships never became close. She might remember moments when companions laughed easily together, only to grow distant when parents entered the room. Such experiences could leave her feeling quietly separated from the group around her. In some households, tutors and governesses attempted to soften these differences by emphasizing discipline and shared education. Lessons in reading, religious instruction, and etiquette brought children together under structured supervision. Within these controlled environments, social distinctions appeared less obvious. Yet outside those lessons, the same patterns often returned. Gatherings in gardens, walks through estate grounds, or visits to neighboring households provided opportunities for adults to observe interactions. Every movement carried meaning in a society where reputation guided nearly every future decision. The watchfulness of noble mothers formed one of the strongest influences within this environment. These women understood the fragile nature of family honor. Even small associations could become topics of conversation among neighbors and relatives. Their vigilance, therefore, extended to the friendships their children formed. A girl whose birth raised questions could easily become the subject of such vigilance. Mothers might speak politely to her during visits, while quietly guiding their own daughters toward different companions. The process required no confrontation, only subtle adjustments repeated over time. Gradually, the child herself began to recognize the pattern. Certain eyes lingered on her longer than others. Conversations occasionally shifted when she approached. Adults asked careful questions about her household or her guardians, often with a curiosity that seemed slightly too deliberate. These observations rarely turned into open rejection. Tudor society valued politeness, and most families avoided cruelty that might create further gossip. Instead, the distance appeared through quiet restraint and cautious manners. Over the years, these small signals formed a consistent message. The girl belonged within the noble world, yet she remained slightly outside its center. Her presence was acknowledged, but always examined. The whispers that had surrounded her birth did not disappear as she grew older. They simply traveled with her into new rooms and new gatherings, carried by memories that the court had never fully forgotten. Rumors that began before the child's baptism continued to accompany her as she grew older. Families watched her carefully, measuring every friendship and every appearance. Within that steady observation, the question of her true place in noble society remained quietly unresolved. Education within Tudor noble society rarely existed as a simple matter of curiosity or personal growth. Families viewed learning as preparation for future roles that supported the household's political and social ambitions. The kind of education a child received, therefore, reflected the expectations placed upon that child. For daughters, whose birth carried uncertainty, those expectations often remained modest. In prominent households, legitimate daughters of noble families were usually trained carefully from a young age. Their education included reading, writing, religious instruction, music, and languages such as French or Latin. Tutors and governesses also guided them in etiquette, diplomacy, and the complex social behavior required at court. Every lesson prepared them for the possibility of becoming the wife of a powerful man. These girls learned how to host gatherings, how to manage large households, and how to represent their families in public ceremonies. Their education was not merely intellectual. It was political preparation for a life that might influence alliances between powerful families. For a daughter born to a mistress, the same level of preparation rarely appeared. Even when she lived within respectable surroundings, the long-term expectations surrounding her future often remained limited. Families did not always see value in investing heavily in an education designed for positions she was unlikely to occupy. As a result, the girl might receive only a simpler form of instruction. She could learn to read religious texts, practice basic writing, and understand household duties. Music or embroidery might also form part of her training. These skills allowed her to function comfortably within a modest household, but they did not necessarily prepare her for the demanding social responsibilities expected of high-ranking noblewomen. The difference between these two paths might appear subtle during childhood. Lessons still took place in quiet rooms, with tutors guiding their students through books and prayers. Yet the depth and ambition of those lessons often revealed the distinction. Legitimate daughters practiced languages used in diplomacy, while the education of a mistress's daughter often stopped at more practical subjects. In Tudor society, education reflected opportunity. Families invested in the training of children who were expected to strengthen the household's influence. When a girl's origins made ambitious alliances unlikely, that investment gradually decreased. This pattern influenced how others perceived the girl as she grew older. Without the same level of education in courtly behavior, she might feel less confident during formal gatherings. Conversations among nobles often involved politics, literature, or diplomatic matters. A girl whose training had not prepared her for such discussions could easily remain silent. Silence, in turn, reinforced existing assumptions about her place within society. Observers might interpret her reserve as a sign that she lacked refinement or preparation for a prominent role. In reality, her education had simply followed the expectations others had placed upon her long before she reached adulthood. The narrowing of opportunity rarely happened in a single moment. Instead, it developed through a series of practical decisions. Tutors assigned to other children might devote less time to her lessons. Books intended for advanced instruction might never reach her desk. Invitations to participate in certain cultural activities could gradually disappear. Looking back, it becomes clear how strongly Tudor society believed in preparing individuals only for the roles they were expected to occupy. Education did not aim to expand possibilities. It aimed to reinforce the structure that already existed. For daughters connected to scandal through their birth, this structure placed clear limits on ambition. Families often assumed that their future would unfold within quieter environments, far removed from political influence. Training them for positions they were unlikely to obtain seemed unnecessary. The girl herself might begin to sense this shift as she grew older. Watching other young women practice languages or study advanced subjects could reveal differences that had once been invisible during early childhood. The contrast between their preparation and her own education slowly clarified the expectations surrounding her life. Even so, the education she received still provided certain advantages. Literacy, discipline, and religious instruction offered stability in a society where many people possessed far fewer opportunities. These skills allowed her to function comfortably within respectable households, even if those households stood outside the center of power. Yet the broader pattern remained difficult to ignore. As legitimate daughters prepared for influential marriages and public responsibilities, the path available to a mistress's daughter gradually narrowed. The world of high political alliances continued moving forward without her participation. Over time, this quiet separation shaped how the court viewed her presence. She remained part of the noble world, yet the roles open to her grew smaller with each passing year. Education within Tudor society revealed the expectations placed upon every child. Legitimate daughters received careful preparation for influence, while others were guided toward quieter and more limited paths. Each restricted lesson quietly confirmed how narrow the girl's future had already begun to become. Convents occupied a quiet but significant place within Tudor society. Behind high stone walls and heavy wooden doors, religious houses offered an environment removed from the noise and constant observation of court life. For many noble families, these institutions served not only spiritual purposes, but also practical ones. They provided a respectable destination for daughters whose presence in the public world might create difficulty. In a society deeply concerned with reputation, removing a potential source of scandal from daily view often appeared to be the simplest solution. A girl born to a mistress could grow into a constant reminder of a complicated relationship. Her resemblance to her father, the rumors surrounding her birth, and the questions about her legitimacy all had the potential to revive stories that powerful families preferred to leave behind. Sending such a girl to a convent allowed those stories to fade more easily. Life within religious houses followed routines of prayer, study, and communal work. The environment discouraged gossip and limited contact with the political world outside the walls. From the perspective of the family, this separation created a sense of order. The decision often appeared reasonable when explained publicly. A convent provided education, discipline, and spiritual guidance. Noble daughters had long entered religious life, voluntarily or as part of family tradition. When a girl connected to a scandal was placed in such a setting, the arrangement could therefore be presented as a respectable choice rather than an act of concealment. Behind that explanation, however, practical concerns usually remained clear. Distance reduced attention. Once a girl lived within a convent, she rarely appeared at court gatherings where her presence might provoke renewed discussion. Without regular visibility, the memory of her origins slowly lost its urgency. For the father's household, this arrangement also protected family honor. Tudor noble families depended heavily on the appearance of stability and moral authority. Any reminder of unofficial relationships could weaken that image. By placing the daughter in a religious environment, the family could maintain the impression that order within the household remained intact. The decision carried additional political advantages as well. Inheritance and marriage alliances formed the foundation of aristocratic power. Every daughter of noble blood represented a potential connection between families. When a girl whose birth raised questions remained active in society, she might complicate those calculations. Inside a convent, those possibilities disappeared. Religious vows removed the expectation of marriage and inheritance. The girl would not form alliances through marriage, nor would she produce children who might claim connection to the family line. From the perspective of those managing estates and titles, this outcome simplified the future. Looking back, it is easy to see why convents became a frequent destination for daughters in uncertain positions. The solution required no public conflict and no official condemnation. Instead, it relied on institutions that society already respected. For the girl herself, however, the experience could be complex. Some young women adapted to convent life with genuine devotion. The structured routine offered stability, and the intellectual environment of certain houses allowed opportunities for reading, writing, and reflection that might not have existed elsewhere. Other girls entered reluctantly, guided more by family expectations than personal calling. Life within a convent followed strict schedules that limited personal freedom. Days were organized around prayers, study, and work within the community. The outside world appeared only through occasional letters or carefully supervised visits. Yet, even in such circumstances, the convent provided something that the court had rarely offered the girl before: distance from constant judgment. Inside those walls, the whispers about her birth carried less importance. Every woman within the community lived under the same rules and routines. The contrast between these two worlds could feel striking. At court, every gesture had been observed and interpreted. Within the convent, daily life focused on repetition and quiet discipline. For some girls, this environment created a form of calm that had been impossible elsewhere. Still, the original purpose behind many of these arrangements remained clear. Families sent daughters to convents not only for spiritual reasons, but also to remove uncertainty from their public lives. The solution allowed everyone involved to avoid open conflict while restoring the appearance of order. Over time, the court often forgot the girl's presence entirely. Without appearances at gatherings or participation in noble society, her story gradually faded from conversation. What had once been a visible reminder of scandal became a quiet memory hidden behind stone walls. Convents offered families a quiet method for restoring stability when a daughter's presence created discomfort. Within those walls, reputation could be protected, and political complications quietly removed. Yet behind the calm routines of religious life, the decision to send the girl there carried its own silent meaning. Life inside a Tudor convent followed rhythms very different from those of the court. The halls of noble households echoed with conversation, music, and the movement of servants carrying messages from room to room. Behind the thick stone walls of a convent, however, daily existence unfolded in a quieter and more disciplined pattern. A young woman entering such a place often experienced the change immediately. The buildings themselves created a sense of separation from the outside world. High walls surrounded the grounds. Heavy gates limited movement, and narrow windows allowed only small views of the countryside beyond. The structure of the convent reminded everyone inside that their lives now followed a different purpose. Days began early, often before sunrise. Bells signaled the first prayers of the morning, calling the community together in silence. Women gathered in the chapel to begin the routine of devotion that would continue throughout the day. Prayer, reading of religious texts, and periods of reflection filled the hours that once might have been spent attending court gatherings or social visits. The discipline within these communities was strict but predictable. Each member of the convent followed the same schedule. Meals were simple and taken at fixed times. Work within the household rotated between duties such as maintaining the chapel, preparing food, or tending gardens within the enclosed grounds. For a girl who had grown up near the court, the contrast could feel striking. Court life had been filled with movement and uncertainty. Visitors arrived constantly, Alliances shifted quickly, and conversations carried hidden meanings. Inside the convent, the rhythm of the day rarely changed. Silence formed an important part of this environment. Many religious houses encouraged limited conversation outside designated hours. This rule helped maintain focus on spiritual life and prevented unnecessary distraction. As a result, corridors often remained quiet, broken only by the sound of footsteps or the turning of pages. Over time, this quiet routine created a sense of separation from the political world that once surrounded the girl. News from the court might arrive occasionally through letters or visiting relatives. Yet such information rarely influenced the daily structure of convent life. For some women, this separation brought relief. Life at court required constant attention to reputation and behavior. Every word could be interpreted, and every association carried consequences. Within the convent, those social calculations mattered far less. Each member of the community held the same religious identity, regardless of family background. For others, however, the quiet also carried a feeling of confinement. The routines are repeated with little variation from week to week and year to year. Opportunities for travel or personal ambition disappeared almost entirely. The outside world continued to change. Yet the environment inside the convent remained largely the same. A young woman placed there, because of family circumstances, might slowly recognize that the decision had shaped the rest of her life. Religious vows often created permanent commitments. Even in houses where strict vows were not required immediately, the expectation of long-term residence remained clear. Looking back, it is striking how effectively such institutions could remove someone from the center of society. A girl who might once have appeared in court gatherings or noble households now lived within a small, enclosed community. Her identity gradually shifted from daughter of a controversial relationship to member of a religious order. Within the convent, personal history often faded into the background. The routines of prayer and work encouraged humility and shared responsibility. A woman's past connections mattered less than her participation in the life of the community. Yet the decision that brought her there continued to shape everything that followed. While legitimate daughters of noble families formed marriages and alliances that influenced the political landscape, she remained separated from those possibilities. This separation did not necessarily involve cruelty. Many families genuinely believed that a convent offered safety, respectability, and spiritual purpose. The institution protected the girl from the constant scrutiny that had once surrounded her. Still, the effect remained unmistakable. Once inside those stone walls, her position in society became defined by the role assigned to her there. The choices available beyond the convent gradually disappeared. In time, years passed with little change to the rhythm of her life. The same bells marked the hours of prayer. The same quiet corridors connected the chapel, the dormitory, and the gardens within the walls. Outside, the political world of the Tudor court continued its shifting alliances and rivalries. Inside, life remained steady and enclosed. The convent offered peace and discipline. Yet it also created a permanent distance from the world the girl had once known. The routines behind those stone walls gradually replaced every possibility that had once existed beyond them. In that quiet separation, her identity became fixed within a life chosen, long before she understood its meaning. Stone corridors existed in both the royal court and the convent. Yet the lives unfolding within them could not have been more different. In palaces, those corridors carried the sound of footsteps moving quickly between chambers, servants delivering messages, and courtiers exchanging quiet conversations that often carried hidden meaning. Within the convent, the same stone walls echoed with far less movement. The pace slowed, the voices softened, and the rhythm of daily life followed rules that rarely changed. For a girl who had once lived near the court, the transition between these two worlds could feel almost surreal. She had grown up in spaces where power moved constantly through rooms filled with color, music, and elaborate ceremony. The court had been a place where every gathering carried importance and where people measured their words carefully because influence could rise or fall within a single conversation. Inside the convent, those concerns faded quickly. The buildings still carried the weight of stone and history, but the purpose of those structures had changed. Instead of guiding visitors toward audiences and feasts, the corridors now led toward chapels, small chambers, and quiet gardens enclosed by walls. The girls' daily routine reflected this difference. In the court environment, life had often followed the unpredictable schedule of powerful households. Guests arrived unexpectedly. Celebrations interrupted ordinary days, and the atmosphere constantly shifted with political developments. Within the convent, time moved according to the sound of bells. Morning prayers began the day before. Sunlight fully entered the narrow windows of the chapel. Afterward came simple meals, to study of religious texts, and hours of work shared among the members of the community. Tasks might include tending gardens, maintaining the buildings, or copying written materials used for teaching and worship. Each day repeated this structure with remarkable consistency. The routine created stability, but also reinforced the separation between the convent and the outside world. While the court remained a place of negotiation and ambition, the convent existed as an environment deliberately removed from those ambitions. For the girl who had once been observed by courtiers, this new setting carried a different kind of attention. Here, she was no longer measured by resemblance, lineage, or rumour. Instead, she was judged by discipline, obedience, and participation in the religious life of the community. In some ways, this shift brought a certain peace. The quiet expectations of the convent replaced the subtle tensions that had surrounded her childhood. No one studied her face to search for similarities with a powerful man. No one questioned her origins during social gatherings. Yet the calm carried its own form of distance. The world she had once known now existed only in memory. News from the court might arrive through letters, but such reports rarely changed the routines of the convent. Events that once might have shaped her future now unfolded far beyond the reach of her daily life. Occasionally, visitors from noble families entered the convent for brief meetings or religious observances. Their clothing and conversation carried faint reminders of the world outside. For a moment, those visits might recall the halls and ceremonies that had once defined her surroundings. When the visitors departed, however, the silence returned quickly. The gates closed, the bells resumed their rhythm, and the life within the walls continued unchanged. Looking back, the similarity between the two environments appears almost symbolic. Both the court and the convent were built from stone and organized through a strict hierarchy. Each place demanded discipline and loyalty from those who lived within it. Yet the goals of those hierarchies differed greatly. The court existed to distribute power, manage alliances, and shape the future of the kingdom. The convent existed to remove individuals from those struggles and guide them towards spiritual reflection. For daughters whose presence created discomfort within noble households, this second environment offered a convenient solution. Their movement from palace corridors to convent corridors allowed families to preserve their reputation without open conflict. The girl herself might slowly come to understand this reality as the years passed. At first, the change appeared simply as a shift in daily routine. Over time, however, it became clear that the new life carried a permanence that the court had never intended to challenge. While legitimate daughters participated in marriages that strengthened political alliances, she remained within a world defined by prayer and quiet discipline. The ambitions of noble families continued without her involvement. The stone corridors of the convent, therefore, represented more than architecture. They marked the boundary between two different destinies. One path led toward influence and alliances within the court. The other led toward a life removed from those struggles. For many girls placed in these institutions, the second path became their permanent home. The corridors of the palace had once carried the sounds of power and ambition, Inside the convent, those echoes faded into quiet routines and steady prayer. What had once been a life surrounded by influence slowly transformed into a memory that remained far beyond the reach of those stone walls. Not every daughter connected to a scandalous birth ended her life behind the walls of a convent. In some situations, families choose a different solution that appears more practical. Instead of removing the girl entirely from society, they arranged marriages that placed her far from the center of court life. These marriages rarely involved powerful noble houses. Families concerned with reputation preferred safer alliances that would not attract attention. A minor gentleman, a distant branch of a noble family, or a landowner whose household existed far from the royal court often became the most suitable choice. Such arrangements allowed everyone involved to maintain a sense of dignity. The girl entered marriage, which remained the expected path for women in Tudor society. At the same time, the distance between her new household and the political heart of the kingdom ensured that her origins would not disturb delicate alliances among the highest ranks of the nobility. The negotiations for these marriages usually took place quietly. Unlike grand alliances celebrated with elaborate ceremonies, these unions rarely appeared in court gossip. Letters moved between families. Financial agreements were discussed carefully, and the arrangements slowly took form without attracting unnecessary attention. For the father's household, the result offered a convenient resolution. The daughter would have a respectable future. Yet she would no longer remain visible within the social environment where her birth might provoke uncomfortable questions. The husband in such arrangements often belonged to a lower level of the aristocracy. He might possess land, local influence, and enough wealth to maintain a respectable household. But he rarely held a position close to the royal court. His interests usually focused on managing estates, supervising tenants, and maintaining order within his region. This difference in status served an important purpose. A man whose life centered on local responsibilities had less reason to bring his wife into the court society. The marriage, therefore, created a natural distance between the girl and the environment where her story had first become known. The journey to this new life often marked a turning point. Leaving the familiar regions near the court meant travelling to towns or estates where the political world of the capital seemed distant and abstract. The landscape itself could feel different. Fields replaced palace gardens, and daily life revolved around agricultural cycles rather than royal ceremonies. Within these quieter settings, the girl's identity gradually changed. She became the wife of a local gentleman rather than the daughter of a controversial relationship. Neighbours might know little about the details of her childhood, and the questions that once surrounded her birth carried less importance. The rhythm of her days also changed. Instead of navigating the careful etiquette of court gatherings, she now supervised household duties, managed servants, and participated in the local community. Church attendance, seasonal festivals, and estate management filled the calendar. Looking back, it becomes clear that this life offered a different kind of stability. While the court provided excitement and opportunity, it also exposed every detail of a person's history to constant scrutiny. In contrast, provincial life allowed certain stories to fade naturally over time. Yet the price of this stability remained significant. Distance from the court meant distance from influence. The networks of power that shaped national politics rarely reached these quieter regions. The woman, who had once lived near the center of those networks, now existed outside them. Her children would grow up with a different understanding of the world as well. Instead of witnessing the daily negotiations of nobles and ambassadors, they would learn the responsibilities of managing land and maintaining local authority. Their lives would unfold within communities where family reputation still mattered, but where court scandals held far less weight. In many cases, these daughters gradually disappeared from the records that documented court life. Historians studying the Tudor period often focus on kings, queens, and the noble families who competed for influence around them. Women who married into distant households rarely appeared in those stories. This absence does not mean their lives lacked meaning. Within their communities, they formed families, managed estates, and contributed to the stability of the regions where they lived. Their influence simply operated on a smaller stage than the one they might once have known. The decision to arrange such marriages reflected the practical thinking of noble families. By guiding the daughter toward a respectable but distant life, they protected their reputation while ensuring that the girl did not remain trapped within the shadow of scandal. Over time, the memory of her origins often faded in the places where she built her new life. Neighbors saw only the household she maintained and the responsibilities she carried as a wife and mother. The court that had once observed her so carefully continued its own complicated struggles for power, rarely noticing that she had quietly vanished from its attention. Marriage offered some daughters a path away from the scrutiny that had followed them since birth. Distance from the court allowed their lives to settle into quieter patterns, far from political rivalry. Yet even in those distant households, the question of their connection to a powerful father never disappeared entirely from memory. In Tudor society, the relationship between a powerful father and a daughter born outside marriage often remained complicated and carefully controlled. The connection could exist clearly in private, yet appear uncertain or even invisible in public. A man who held influence within the court had to balance personal responsibility with the expectations placed upon him by reputation, law, and family alliances. Many fathers chose a path of quiet acknowledgement. They understood that abandoning the child entirely could damage their own sense of honor and attract criticism among those who valued responsibility within noble households. At the same time, openly recognizing the girl as their daughter risked drawing attention to a relationship they might prefer to keep discreet. Because of this tension, acknowledgement often appeared through indirect actions rather than formal declarations. Financial assistance became the most common expression of responsibility. A yearly allowance might be arranged to ensure the child's upbringing remained comfortable. Servants could be assigned to her household, and tutors might be provided to supervise her education. These arrangements allowed the father to demonstrate care without challenging the official structure of his family. The daughter benefited from his resources, yet she did not receive the legal recognition that legitimate children enjoyed. In some cases, the father's involvement extended beyond financial support. He might visit occasionally or maintain contact through trusted intermediaries. Gifts could arrive on religious holidays or birthdays, offering reminders that he remained aware of her existence. Yet these gestures rarely removed the distance between them. The father's public life continued to revolve around his official household, where his wife and legitimate heirs represented the future of the family name. The daughter, born outside marriage, therefore, occupied a different position that rarely overlapped with that central narrative. Public acknowledgement often remained impossible. In a society where lineage determined inheritance and alliances, openly recognizing an illegitimate child could complicate delicate political relationships. Rivals might use such information to question a nobleman's moral authority or stability within his household. For this reason, some fathers chose a more cautious approach and avoided recognition entirely in public settings. The daughter might grow up receiving financial support, but hearing little about her father's identity beyond quiet hints from those around her. This situation created a peculiar contradiction. The girl might know that a powerful man stood behind her for comfort and protection, yet she could not speak openly about that connection in polite society. Conversations about family history often stopped before reaching his name. For the daughter, this distance shaped the emotional character of the relationship. Children naturally look for signs of affection and belonging from their parents. When the father's presence appeared only occasionally, or through indirect gestures, the bond between them developed in unusual ways. Some girls accepted the arrangement with quiet understanding. They recognized that their father's position within the court required careful discretion. Others felt the absence more strongly, noticing that legitimate children received attention and acknowledgement that remained out of reach for them. Looking back, it becomes clear that Tudor society placed powerful men in difficult positions when dealing with children born outside marriage. Personal responsibility often collided with the political realities of aristocratic life. Maintaining the stability of the official household remained the highest priority. Financial support, therefore, became the compromise that allowed both obligations to coexist. The father could ensure the child's safety and comfort without altering the legal structure of inheritance or provoking unnecessary attention. Even with these arrangements, the emotional distance between father and daughter often remained visible. Their lives unfolded in separate environments. The father continued navigating court politics and managing estates, while the daughter grew up under the supervision of relatives, guardians, or distant households. Occasional meetings might occur, but they rarely developed into the daily presence that defined relationships within legitimate families. The girl understood that her father belonged primarily to another household, one whose stability depended on careful appearances. Over time, this understanding shaped how she viewed her own identity. She might appreciate the protection his resources provided, while recognizing that her place within his life remained limited. The connection between them existed quietly, supported by money, discretion, and occasional kindness. Yet the absence of open acknowledgement created a boundary that neither of them could easily cross. Within the carefully managed world of Tudor aristocracy, such arrangements became common enough to seem ordinary. Powerful men continued their public lives while ensuring that children born outside marriage received enough support to survive without disturbing the balance of the court. A powerful father could provide comfort, protection, and financial security for a daughter born outside marriage. Yet, recognition often remained private, hidden behind careful decisions and quiet gestures. In the space between support and silence, the bond between father and daughter developed at a distance, neither of them fully controlled. Within a Tudor noble household, the legal wife held a position defined by authority, responsibility, and constant scrutiny. Marriage was not only a personal relationship, but also a political contract that connected families and secured inheritance. The wife, therefore, represented stability and legitimacy within the household. Her role included protecting the reputation of the family and ensuring that her children remained the unquestioned heirs of the family name. When a child born to a mistress appeared within the wider orbit of the household, the wife faced a delicate situation. Public confrontation rarely served her interests. Tudor society valued composure and dignity among noble women, and any visible anger might encourage gossip that damaged the household's reputation. Because of this, many wives approached the matter with controlled restraint. They acknowledged the existence of the child without allowing that acknowledgement to disrupt the structure of their own family. Their behavior often appeared calm and polite. Yet behind that politeness existed careful calculation. In some cases, the wife expressed a form of measured sympathy toward the girl. The child herself had not chosen the circumstances of her birth, and open hostility toward a young girl could appear cruel to observers. Offering limited kindness allowed the wife to demonstrate generosity while maintaining the moral authority expected of her position. This kindness, however, rarely meant full acceptance. The wife understood clearly that her primary duty involved protecting the future of her legitimate children. Any situation that threatened that future required careful management. A girl connected to the husband through an unofficial relationship could become a potential complication, even if the father had no intention of altering inheritance arrangements. The visible presence of the child might invite speculation among relatives or political rivals. Questions about favoritism or hidden obligations could weaken the stability of the household. For this reason, the wife often preferred to maintain distance between the girl and the center of family life. Such distance could be created through practical decisions that appeared reasonable on the surface. The child might live in another residence rather than within the main household. Visits to the family estate could remain rare and carefully supervised. When gatherings brought many relatives together, the girl's presence might be considered unnecessary. These choices allowed the wife to preserve outward harmony while quietly limiting the child's influence. No harsh words were required. The structure of the household itself ensured that the girl remained outside the circle of legitimate heirs. Looking back, it becomes clear how subtle these strategies could be. Tudor noblewomen rarely possessed the legal authority to control their husbands' actions directly. Instead, they used social influence and household management to protect their position. Servants often responded quickly to these signals. If the wife demonstrated that a particular child did not belong within the daily life of the household, servants adjusted their behavior accordingly. Invitations became less frequent, accommodations less convenient, and opportunities for close contact gradually disappeared. The wife's relatives could also play a role in reinforcing this distance. Brothers, huissiers, and family advisors sometimes encouraged solutions that removed potential sources of tension. Their concern focused on preserving the family's reputation and ensuring that the inheritance remained clear. Over time, the combined effect of these quiet decisions usually achieved the intended result. The girl slowly drifted away from the center of the household's life. Her presence no longer appeared in daily routines, and the legitimate children grew up without constant reminders of the situation. From the outside, this process often appeared orderly and calm. There were no public arguments, no dramatic expulsions, and no visible cruelty. Instead, the household returned gradually to a state where the official family structure remained unquestioned. For the girl herself, however, the outcome carried a different meaning. She might remember occasional encounters with the father's household or brief glimpses of the family whose name she could not fully share. Those moments could feel confusing, especially during childhood, when the reasons behind such distance remained unclear. The wife rarely explained these choices directly. Her responsibility lay not in comforting the child, but in protecting the future of her own family. Within the strict hierarchy of Tudor society, that responsibility held greater weight than personal sympathy. Even when compassion existed, it remained carefully controlled. A small gift, a polite greeting, or a brief visit could express kindness without inviting a deeper connection. These gestures allowed the wife to appear generous while maintaining the boundaries that preserved her authority. Over time, the arrangement often settled into quiet acceptance. The girl grew up elsewhere. The legitimate family continued its life at court, and the delicate balance within the household remained intact. A Tudor wife rarely confronted the existence of her husband's child directly. Instead, she protected her household through calm decisions that created distance and preserved order. Within that careful distance, the girl slowly moved beyond the reach of the family whose blood she quietly shared. Decisions within Tudor noble households rarely appeared as dramatic commands. Authority often moved quietly through conversations held in private chambers, through suggestions offered at the right moment, and through agreements that seemed practical rather than forceful. Among these quiet decisions, a few carried consequences as lasting as those that shaped the future of a child whose birth complicated the household's reputation. A legal wife occupied a position that allowed her influence to operate in subtle but powerful ways. While she might not publicly command the fate of every person connected to the household, her voice carried weight in matters concerning family stability. Advisors, relatives, and even the husband himself often recognized that her approval helped maintain the appearance of order within the family. When the presence of a mistress's daughter continued to attract attention, the question of her future eventually demanded resolution. The girl could not remain indefinitely within the uncertain space between acknowledgement and distance. Her existence invited constant speculation, and speculation threatened the calm structure that noble households tried carefully to preserve. The wife rarely needed to confront the matter directly. Instead, she could introduce the idea of a solution that appeared reasonable to everyone involved. Such discussions often took place in calm tones during private conversations, where practical concerns replaced emotional arguments. A convent frequently emerged as the most acceptable answer. Religious houses had long provided respectable homes for daughters whose families preferred quiet lives for them. The institution offered education, discipline, and spiritual purpose, all framed within traditions that Tudor society respected. By presenting the convent as a thoughtful opportunity rather than a removal, the wife avoided accusations of cruelty. The proposal could emphasize the advantages of religious education and the dignity associated with devotion. Advisors might support the idea, describing it as a way to secure the girl's future while protecting the harmony of the household. Once this suggestion entered the conversation, the process often moved forward with little resistance. The father might agree that the arrangement solved several difficulties at once. The child would remain safe, provided for, and guided by respected religious authorities. At the same time, her presence would no longer complicate the delicate relationships within the family. Relatives and household officials usually supported such decisions. Their priority involved preserving stability around the legitimate heirs who represented the continuation of the family line. Removing a potential source of gossip allowed those heirs to grow up without the distractions of scandal. For the girl herself, the change might appear sudden yet carefully organized. Arrangements would be made quietly. Letters would be exchanged with the chosen convent, describing the arrival of a young woman whose family wished her to receive religious instruction. Travel to the convent often occurred with little ceremony. A small group of attendants might accompany the girl on the journey, carrying the belongings necessary for her new life. When the gates closed behind her, the household that had once debated her future returned to its ordinary routines. Looking back, the simplicity of this transition can seem unsettling. A decision made in a private conversation could alter the entire course of a young woman's life. No official proclamation needed to appear. No record described the reasoning in detail. Within Tudor society, however, such quiet authority felt natural. Noble households depended on discretion. Public conflict damaged reputation, while calm solutions allowed everyone involved to maintain dignity. The wife's influence, therefore, operated not through visible power, but through carefully chosen proposals that others found difficult to refuse. By framing the convent as a respectable path, she guided the household toward a decision that protected her own family's position. The court itself often accepted these outcomes without comment. Convents regularly welcomed daughters from noble families, and the reasons behind those decisions rarely attracted investigation. Once the girl entered religious life, the whispers that had once followed her gradually faded. Years later, few people within the court might remember the discussions that had determined her future. The household continued producing legitimate heirs, managing estates, and participating in political alliances. Meanwhile, the young woman lived within a new world defined by prayer, routine, and separation from the ambitions that had once surrounded her childhood. Within Tudor households, life-changing decisions rarely required open confrontation. A carefully timed suggestion could reshape a future while preserving the appearance of harmony. In the quiet space between conversation and agreement, the convent door slowly closed behind the girl. For many years, convents had provided a quiet refuge for daughters whose presence created difficulty within noble households. Behind stone walls, their lives followed routines that rarely changed. Prayer, study, and daily work offered stability far removed from the unpredictable atmosphere of the court. Families believed that once a girl entered this environment, her future would remain calm and protected. This sense of permanence began to change during the reign of Henry VIII. Political and religious tensions gradually reshaped the institutions that had once seemed untouchable. What had long been part of the spiritual structure of England suddenly became subject to royal authority and reform. The conflict between the English crown and the authority of the Roman Church introduced a period of dramatic transformation. Decisions made within royal councils and parliaments reached far beyond theology. They altered land ownership, religious practice, and the daily lives of thousands of people who had never participated in political debates. Among the most significant changes was the process known as the dissolution of the monasteries. Through a series of royal orders, religious houses across the country were inspected, reorganized, and eventually closed. Lands belonging to monasteries and convents were seized by the crown and redistributed to loyal supporters. For communities that had existed quietly for centuries, the effect was immediate. Buildings once devoted to prayer and religious study suddenly faced uncertainty. Officials arrived to inventory property, examine finance, and report on the condition of each institution. Within convent walls, the atmosphere changed quickly. Women who had expected to live their entire lives within those communities began hearing rumors about closures and confiscations. Letters from neighboring houses confirmed that similar inspections had already taken place elsewhere. For daughters placed in convents by their families, the news carried particular significance. Many of them had entered religious life, not out of personal devotion, but because their households believed the institution offered a stable solution to complicated family circumstances. Now, that stability appeared fragile. If the convent itself ceased to exist, the quiet arrangement that had removed them from the centre of society would disappear as well. The process unfolded gradually but steadily. Smaller houses were often the first to close. Their members received instructions to leave, sometimes with modest pensions meant to support them after departure. Larger institutions continued operating for a short time, yet even they understood that their future remained uncertain. For the women living within those communities, departure required difficult decisions. Some returned to families, who welcomed them back into private households. Others searched for new religious communities abroad, where convent life still continued, without interference from the English crown. For daughters whose families had once chosen the convent as a solution to scandal, the situation became more complicated. Returning home meant re-entering the same social environment that had once rejected their presence. Years might have passed since they last lived near the court or among the noble circles connected to their birth. In that time, the political world continued moving forward. Alliances had shifted. Families had grown. And the quiet memory of past scandals might still linger. The sudden closure of convents, therefore, forced families to reconsider decisions they had once believed permanent. A daughter who had disappeared behind stone walls could now return unexpectedly into the world that had tried to forget her. Looking back, this transformation reveals how deeply political decisions could reshape private lives. A royal policy designed to challenge religious authority also disrupted countless personal arrangements that had depended on the stability of religious institutions. For many women, convent life had offered more than religious devotion. It had provided shelter from complicated social circumstances and allowed families to preserve their reputation without open conflict. When those institutions vanished, the careful balance they had maintained disappeared as well. The daughters who had once lived quietly inside them now faced the uncertain question of where they truly belonged. The world beyond the convent gates had not remained still during their years of absence. The court continued its rivalries. Noble families pursued new alliances, and the political landscape of England shifted rapidly under the authority of a king determined to reshape his kingdom. For years, the convent had hidden these daughters from the conflicts of noble society. The reforms of Henry VIII suddenly removed those walls and forced many women back into a world that had once rejected them. Somewhere beyond the quiet ruins of those religious houses, their uncertain future waited again. Departure from the convent rarely resembled a triumphant return to ordinary life. For many women, who had spent years behind those stone walls, the outside world had moved forward without them. Customs, alliances, and households had changed. What once seemed familiar now felt distant and uncertain. Inside the convent, life had followed a rhythm that protected its residents from the unpredictability of noble society. Food arrived at regular hours. Duties were clear, and the community itself created a form of quiet stability. When those institutions were dissolved, that stability vanished almost overnight. Women, who had once believed their lives would remain within those walls, suddenly faced the difficult task of rebuilding their place in society. For daughters of former mistresses, this challenge often proved even more complicated. Unlike legitimate daughters raised openly within noble households, they could not always rely on strong family protection. The circumstances of their birth often meant that relationships with powerful relatives remained distant or uncertain. Some fathers offered financial assistance, but this support rarely translated into full acceptance within the family structure. Without the protection of a household, and without the clear identity that legitimate daughters possessed, many of these women entered the world with limited options. Their upbringing within convent life had provided discipline and education, yet it had also separated them from the social networks that guided most marriages and alliances. Marriage in Tudor society depended heavily on family reputation and financial negotiation. Dowries played a central role in arranging respectable matches. Families used these payments to secure alliances with other households and to ensure that daughters entered marriages with a degree of security. For daughters who had spent years hidden within religious communities, such resources were often absent. The quiet arrangement that once protected family honor rarely included the preparation of a dowry large enough to attract suitable husbands. Without this financial support, the number of possible marriages narrowed quickly. Noble families seeking alliances preferred brides who strengthened their political and economic position. A woman without wealth or strong family backing offered little advantage in such negotiations. Some women found alternative paths within respectable households. They served as companions to noble ladies, tutors for young children, or assistants managing domestic duties. These roles provided shelter and modest income, yet they also reinforced a social distance between them and the families they served. Living within another household meant depending on the goodwill of employers whose priorities might change at any moment. Stability often remained fragile. A change in family circumstances or a shift in favor could quickly remove the protection they had only recently regained. Other women attempted to establish quiet lives within small towns or rural communities. Their education allowed them to read, write, and assist with clerical tasks, skills that could be useful within local parishes or merchant households. These positions offered independence, though they rarely brought the comfort associated with noble birth. Looking back, it becomes clear how strongly Tudor society depended on formal structures of legitimacy. Women who stood outside those structures often discovered that their lives required constant negotiation. The absence of a dowry, the uncertainty of family support, and the lingering memory of their origins combined to create a delicate position. Each opportunity depended not only on personal ability, but also on the willingness of others to overlook the circumstances of their birth. For some, the experience of convent life had provided valuable preparation for these challenges. Years spent within disciplined communities had taught patience, organization, and quiet resilience. These qualities sometimes allowed them to navigate the uncertain world beyond the convent walls. Yet the contrast between expectation and reality remained striking. Families who once believed that convent life had solved a delicate problem now faced the reappearance of daughters whose futures had never truly been secured. The disappearance of religious institutions had revealed a deeper truth about Tudor society. Solutions that seemed permanent often depended on fragile political and religious systems. When those systems changed, the personal consequences spread far beyond the decisions made at court. Many of these women, therefore, lived lives defined by quiet adaptation. They learned to build new connections, accept modest circumstances, and move carefully within a society that had never fully decided where they belonged. Leaving the convent did not restore the security these women had once known. Instead, it revealed how uncertain their place in the world truly remained. In the quiet spaces between households and expectations, many began to repeat patterns that had shaped their mothers' lives. After leaving the protection of convent walls, many women entered a world that offered far fewer paths than they had once imagined. The structures that shaped Tudor society were rigid and deeply concerned with reputation. Birth determined opportunity, and opportunity determined survival. For daughters born from relationships that had never been publicly recognized, this structure often narrowed their choices long before they understood the consequences. Some women managed to find quiet places within respectable households. Their education, gained during years of religious instruction, allowed them to work as tutors or companions. Noble families often needed educated women who could teach children reading, prayer, and proper manners. These positions were modest but respectable. They offered shelter, regular meals, and a place within the rhythms of domestic life. Yet these roles rarely brought security in the long term. A tutor depended entirely on the goodwill of the family she served. If the household changed its plans, moved away, or simply replaced her with someone younger or more connected, she could find herself searching for another position with little warning. Stability remained fragile. Others attempted to live independently in small towns, using their literacy to assist merchants, clerks, or local parish communities. These lives rarely attracted attention from the powerful circles of the court. Instead, they unfolded quietly in places where noble politics mattered little. In such environments, a woman's past sometimes faded enough for her to build a modest existence. But not every story moved toward quiet independence. The same social pressures that had shaped their mothers' lives still existed within Tudor society. Wealth, protection, and influence remained concentrated among powerful men. Women without family support sometimes discovered that survival required entering relationships that resembled the circumstances of their birth. Some daughters, therefore, became involved with wealthy patrons who offered financial support in exchange for companionship. These arrangements did not always appear scandalous at first. A young woman might live under the protection of a gentleman who admired her education and manners. Gifts, housing, and security followed. Over time, however, the nature of such relationships often became clear. Without marriage, the woman's position depended entirely on the continued favor of the man who supported her. If that favor disappeared, so did the stability she relied upon. The pattern resembled the one that had defined her mother's life years earlier. Looking back, the repetition of these patterns reveals how strongly Tudor society reinforced its own structures. A daughter born outside legitimate marriage often faced barriers that made conventional paths difficult to follow. Without a dowry, without strong family alliances, and without legal recognition, the opportunities available to her remained limited. This repetition created a quiet cycle. A woman whose mother had once lived under the uncertain protection of a powerful man might find herself navigating the same arrangement years later. The circumstances differed in detail, but the underlying structure remained familiar. Not every woman accepted that pattern. Some resisted the expectations placed upon them and sought alternatives through discipline and careful choices. Their lives rarely appeared in court records or noble genealogies. Yet, they existed within towns and villages across England. These women might teach children, manage small households, or assist clergy with record-keeping. Their daily routines left little trace in official history. Unlike noble marriages or political alliances, these quiet lives rarely produced documents that historians could easily discover. For this reason, many daughters of mistresses slowly disappeared from the written record. Their names might appear briefly in parish registers or scattered legal documents before fading entirely from the surviving archives. The absence of records does not mean their lives lacked meaning. It simply reflects the priorities of a society that preserved the stories of power more carefully than the stories of survival. In the end, the fate of these women varied widely. Some lived long lives in quiet communities, respected for their knowledge and discipline. Others experienced the instability that had shaped their childhood, moving between households and relationships in search of security. From a distance, The pattern reveals something unsettling about Tudor society. A world obsessed with legitimacy and inheritance created structures that quietly repeated themselves across generations. Children born outside those structures often struggled to escape the consequences of circumstances they had never chosen. Lives that began in secrecy often continued along uncertain paths shaped by the same social rules that had defined their birth. Some women carved out quiet places within society, while others found themselves repeating familiar arrangements. Between these different paths lies a question about how many of their stories were ever remembered at all. History tends to remember people who held power. Kings leave behind proclamations. Queens appear in portraits. And noble families fill the pages of genealogies that carefully record every marriage and inheritance. The lives of rulers become landmarks that historians return to again and again. Yet the world of Tudor England contained far more people than those whose names filled official chronicles. Beneath the familiar stories of monarchs and political alliances lived countless individuals whose experiences unfolded quietly and left only faint traces behind. Among them were the daughters born to royal and noble mistresses. Their lives existed in the shadow of powerful households, connected to influential bloodlines, yet rarely acknowledged as part of them. They grew up close enough to power to feel its presence, but far enough away that history seldom preserved their names. The structure of Tudor society explains much of this silence. Legitimacy mattered deeply in determining which individuals deserved recognition within official records. Noble families documented the births and marriages of legitimate children because those events shaped inheritance and alliances. Children born outside those formal structures rarely received the same attention. Their existence might be noted in private letters, financial records, or scattered parish documents, but they seldom appeared in the grand genealogies that preserved family history. As time passed, these fragments often became the only evidence that such women had lived at all. A brief entry recording a baptism, a small payment recorded in an estate account, or a passing reference in correspondence could reveal a life that once unfolded within the complicated world of Tudor households. These fragments rarely tell complete stories. They hint at relationships, movements, and moments of recognition without explaining the emotions or decisions that shaped them. Historians must piece together these traces carefully, trying to understand lives that official history did not prioritize. In many cases, the absence of documentation reflects the careful discretion practiced by noble families. Scandal threatened reputation, and reputation influenced political alliances. Quietly minimizing the visibility of certain relationships helped maintain the stability of powerful households. For daughters of mistresses, this discretion meant that their lives often unfolded outside the spotlight of recorded history. Even when they lived near courtly circles, their presence rarely generated the type of documentation that survived across centuries. A marriage arranged quietly in a distant county might leave only a brief note in a parish register. A position as a tutor or companion might appear with no record at all. If a woman entered a convent before the religious upheavals of the 16th century, her name might survive only in lists maintained by the religious community itself. Once those institutions disappeared, even those lists sometimes vanished with them. Looking back from the present, this silence can appear puzzling. Tudor England produced abundant documentation about property, titles, and political affairs, yet the lives of many women remained largely invisible within those records. The reason lies in the priorities of the society that created them. Documents existed to preserve authority, wealth, and inheritance. Individuals who did not directly influence those structures often disappeared from the official narrative. Still, occasional discoveries remind us that these lives existed. Letters exchanged between nobles sometimes mention daughters who lived quietly outside the main household. Estate accounts might record small pensions or payments intended to support a young woman living elsewhere. Such references reveal a world of relationships that official history rarely described openly. Behind the public order of Tudor society existed private networks of responsibility, discretion, and quiet acknowledgement. For historians, these glimpses provide valuable insight into the social realities that surrounded the great figures of the age. They show that the Tudor world contained many lives shaped by circumstances beyond personal control. Daughters born outside official marriage often navigated paths defined by caution and adaptation. Their stories may not appear in royal chronicles. Yet they formed part of the same society that produced those famous names. When we consider the past, it becomes clear that history is not only the story of those who ruled kingdoms, it also includes those who lived quietly beside them, whose lives rarely entered the grand narrative but still shaped the everyday world of their time. These women rarely appeared in the official records that define Tudor history. Their names survived only in scattered notes, brief entries, and fragments of correspondence. Somewhere beyond those fragile traces lies a question about how much of their lives was ever truly recorded at all. Within Tudor society, the difference between legitimate daughters and those born outside formal marriage was not subtle. It shaped nearly every aspect of a girl's future. From childhood onward, the distinction determined education, security, and the kinds of opportunities that might appear later in life. A legitimate daughter entered the world already surrounded by protection. Her birth strengthened alliances between families, and that alliance ensured she was acknowledged openly within the household. Her name appeared in family records, her existence celebrated as part of the continuation of a respected lineage. From the earliest years, these girls were raised with clear expectations. Their families invested in their upbringing because they represented valuable connections between noble houses. Education included reading, writing, religious instruction, and social refinement. They learned how to manage households, host gatherings, and present themselves within the structured environment of courtly society. The purpose behind this preparation was practical. A legitimate daughter would eventually marry, and that marriage would reinforce the political and economic network surrounding her family. Each lesson she received served the long-term goal of placing her successfully within another influential household. Marriage negotiations, therefore, began early. Families carefully considered potential matches that might strengthen alliances, increase landholdings, or secure political loyalty. Conversations about dowries and estates often occurred years before the daughter reached adulthood. Dowries themselves formed a central part of these negotiations. Wealth transferred through marriage offered security for the bride while demonstrating the financial strength of her family. A generous dowry made a daughter attractive to powerful households seeking new alliances. Legal protection reinforced this process. Tudor law recognized legitimate daughters as rightful members of their father's lineage. While sons often received primary inheritance, daughters could still obtain property, income, or titles through carefully arranged agreements. Even when daughters did not inherit large estates directly, their legitimacy guaranteed recognition within family networks. Relatives maintained connections with them, ensuring that they remained part of the broader structure of noble society. In contrast, daughters born outside marriage entered life without these formal protections. Their connection to powerful fathers might exist privately, yet the law rarely acknowledged them as equal members of the family. This absence of legal recognition affected nearly every opportunity available to them. Without legitimate status, they could not rely on inheritance rights or family alliances in the same way legitimate daughters could. Marriage negotiations, therefore, became far more difficult. Noble families seeking alliances preferred brides whose lineage carried clear legal standing. Uncertainty about birth raised questions about inheritance and reputation, both of which played crucial roles in Tudor marriage arrangements. Even when a father quietly supported such a daughter financially, that support rarely carried the same weight as public recognition. Potential husbands might hesitate, uncertain whether a hidden scandal might accompany the marriage. For this reason, the paths available to these women often diverged sharply from those of their legitimate counterparts. While one daughter prepared to strengthen alliances between noble houses, another might search for quieter roles within society. The difference extended beyond marriage, into the realm of memory. Legitimate daughters appeared in family genealogies that preserved the history of noble houses across generations. Their marriages, children, and property transfers became part of the written record. These documents ensured that their names survived long after their lifetimes. Historians, studying noble families, often rely on such genealogies to trace alliances and political developments across centuries. Daughters born outside marriage rarely received the same treatment. Their names might appear occasionally in letters or financial accounts, but they seldom entered the carefully maintained family histories that preserved lineage. As time passed, this absence shaped how later generations understood the past. The official story of noble families focused on legitimate heirs and politically useful marriages, leaving little space for individuals whose existence complicated those narratives. Looking back, the contrast reveals how strongly Tudor society relied on formal structures of legitimacy. Recognition within those structures brought protection, opportunity, and lasting memory. Standing outside them often meant navigating a life defined by quiet compromises and uncertain futures. Legitimate daughters grew up surrounded by law, wealth, and recognition that guided them toward influential marriages. Others lived in the same world, yet remained outside its protections and promises. Between these two paths lies the final question of what traces their hidden bloodlines might have left behind. Within the carefully ordered world of Tudor nobility, lineage defined power. Families preserved their history through genealogies, property records, and marriage alliances that linked one household to another across generations. Every birth carried meaning because it influenced inheritance, land ownership, and political loyalty. Yet alongside these carefully documented family trees existed another set of connections that remained largely unrecorded. These were the quiet bloodlines created by relationships that society preferred not to acknowledge openly. Children born to mistresses often lived outside the official framework of noble lineage. Their names rarely appeared in the same genealogical charts that traced legitimate heirs. Their presence remained discreet, sometimes mentioned in private letters or estate accounts, but seldom celebrated within family records. Despite this silence, the biological connections between these children and their powerful fathers never truly disappeared. Bloodlines continued through marriages, friendships, and quiet arrangements that linked them indirectly to the same noble networks from which they had once been excluded. For many daughters, adulthood eventually brought opportunities to establish households of their own. Even when their marriages took place outside the highest levels of aristocratic society, they still carried traces of the same heritage. A marriage to a modest gentleman, a respected merchant, or a local landowner could create new branches of families whose origins remained only partially understood. The past might not be discussed openly, yet certain physical resemblances or whispered stories sometimes preserved the memory of those connections. Over time, these subtle links spread quietly through the social fabric of England. The descendants of such unions lived ordinary lives, working within communities far removed from the royal courts, where their ancestors had once been entangled in complicated relationships. In many cases, later generations knew little about the circumstances that had shaped their ancestry. Family stories changed with time, and details that once carried social risk gradually softened into vague traditions. A rumor about distant noble blood might circulate within a household, repeated across generations without clear proof. These stories often sounded improbable. Yet occasionally, historians later discovered fragments of evidence that suggested some truth behind them. This quiet persistence of lineage reveals something important about Tudor society. Even though official structures emphasized legitimacy, human relationships rarely followed such strict boundaries. Personal connections created networks that extended beyond the limits of formal recognition. For powerful families, discretion often remained the preferred response to such complexities. Acknowledging unofficial children publicly could disrupt inheritance and political alliances. Allowing quiet support without formal recognition offered a safer compromise. Through financial assistance, educational opportunities, or introductions to respectable households, fathers sometimes ensured that these children could build stable lives. Such gestures rarely appeared in public documents, yet they left traces within family correspondence and estate records. Over generations, these small interventions allowed certain lines to prosper quietly. Descendants might become respected members of local communities, landowners in their own right, or participants in regional politics. While official genealogies ignored their origins, their presence continued to shape the broader network of English society. Connections formed through friendship, marriage, and economic cooperation gradually wove them into the same social fabric as families whose lineage had always been recognized openly. Looking back from the present, this pattern reveals how history often preserves only part of the truth. Official records emphasize legitimacy and authority because those elements mattered most to the institutions that created them. Behind those records existed a more complicated reality, where relationships crossed social boundaries and created families that official history rarely described. The daughters born to Tudor mistresses lived within that quiet reality. Their names seldom appeared beside queens or noble heirs, yet their lives still contributed to the human landscape of their time. Their descendants continued living, marrying, and raising children who carried fragments of the same heritage, even if the origin of that heritage faded gradually from memory. For historians, these hidden bloodlines serve as reminders that the past contains more stories than the official narrative reveals. Beneath the grand chronicles of kings and noble houses lies a quieter history shaped by individuals whose lives unfolded outside formal recognition. The names of these daughters often vanished from the records that preserved noble lineage. Their blood, however, continued moving quietly through generations that followed. Somewhere within those silent family lines remains the final echo of lives that history rarely chose to record. Across the long arc of Tudor society, the story of a mistress's daughter often followed a path shaped long before she understood it. The moment of her birth might pass quietly within a private chamber, attended only by a few servants, and the anxious presence of a mother whose position within the household remained uncertain. Yet even in that first moment, the circumstances surrounding the child already carried consequences that would echo throughout her life. The court itself was a place where every detail travelled quickly. Servants noticed changes in routine. Ladies observed who entered and left private rooms. Rumours spread through corridors long before any official acknowledgement appeared. A child born in secrecy did not remain secret for long. People rarely spoke openly about such matters, but their awareness shaped how they reacted. When the girl appeared during early childhood, curiosity often accompanied her presence. Courtiers watched carefully, studying small similarities that might reveal the identity of her father. A familiar gesture, the shape of a smile, or the colour of the eyes could provoke quiet speculation. In a society that valued lineage deeply, resemblance carried meaning. Observers did not require confirmation to form their own conclusions. Growing up in such an environment created a peculiar existence. The girl lived close to power yet remained outside its official recognition. She might occasionally encounter the man whose blood she shared, though their interactions rarely resembled the relationship between father and daughter acknowledged by law. Her mother's situation influenced every step of this experience. If the mother retained favour, the girl might enjoy modest comfort and access to education. If favour faded, both mother and daughter could quickly disappear from the centre of court life. Childhood, therefore, unfolded beneath careful observation. The girl learned early that certain doors remained closed to her, even if no one explained the reason directly. Invitations arrived selectively. Conversations shifted subtly when she approached. Yet children possess remarkable adaptability. Many of these girls learned to navigate their unusual position with quiet patience. They understood which rooms they could enter, which people greeted them warmly, and which relationships required distance. Education often took place privately. A tutor might teach reading, writing, and religious instruction, preparing the girl for a future that remained undefined. Unlike legitimate daughters raised for influential marriages, her training emphasized modesty and restraint. As she grew older, the social boundaries surrounding her life became clearer. Conversations about marriage occurred in the background of court life, yet rarely included her name. Negotiations that determined the future of legitimate daughters rarely considered the possibility that she might participate in those alliances. For families concerned with reputation, discretion remained essential. The girl's continued presence near the court could invite unnecessary speculation. Over time, the quiet solution often presented itself through institutions that promised dignity without political risk. Religious houses provided exactly that kind of resolution. A convent offered education, stability, and a socially respected environment that allowed families to maintain honor while gently removing a complicated presence from the public eye. The journey to such a place rarely attracted ceremony. Arrangements were made discreetly. Letters traveled between households and religious communities. Within days or weeks, the girl might find herself traveling away from the familiar surroundings of court. Arrival at the convent introduced a different rhythm of life. The noise of courtly intrigue gave way to silence, broken only by prayer and daily routine. Stone walls separated the community from the ambitions and rivalries that had once surrounded her childhood. Inside those walls, expectations changed. Devotion replaced reputation as the guiding principle of daily life. Work, study, and reflection filled the hours that once might have been spent observing the shifting alliances of the court. For some women, this transition offered a form of peace, removed from the uncertainty that had shaped their early years. They could live within a structure that valued discipline and contemplation rather than lineage. Others experienced the change differently. The distance from the world they had once known sometimes carried a quiet sadness. Beyond the convent gates lay families, estates, and political dramas that continued without them. Yet the life within the convent still possessed dignity. Communities of women formed supportive relationships built on shared routines and spiritual purpose. Even those whose arrival reflected complicated family decisions often found stability in this environment. Over time, the memory of court life faded into the background. The girl who had once drawn whispers in royal corridors became another member of a religious community whose concerns centered on faith and daily discipline. Looking back, this path reveals the delicate balance Tudor society tried to maintain between reputation and reality. The existence of mistresses and their children could not be entirely hidden, yet it rarely fit comfortably within the structures that governed noble families. Convents offered a solution that protected appearances while providing a place where these daughters could live without constant scrutiny. The arrangement allowed families to preserve stability while quietly redirecting lives that did not align with official expectations. Through this quiet redirection, many stories disappeared from the grand narrative of Tudor history. The courts continued to record marriages, alliances, and political triumphs, while the lives of these women unfolded far from the attention of chroniclers. Even so, their experiences formed part of the same world. The corridors of power and the silent halls of convents belonged to the same society, connected by decisions made in private conversations and carried out through careful discretion. When we imagine Tudor England today, we often picture crowns, banquets, and rivalries among nobles. Yet, behind those images existed quieter lives, shaped by circumstances rarely acknowledged in official records. The daughters of mistresses lived within that quieter history. Their stories reveal the complexity of a society that celebrated lineage, while quietly managing the realities that did not fit within its formal structures. Across the years, whispers in court corridors could eventually lead to the quiet closing of a convent door. The journey from scandal to silence was not unusual within that world. Tonight, as this story settles into memory, it becomes clear that these lives followed paths shaped by both circumstance and careful decisions made by others. Their childhoods began amid curiosity and speculation. Their adulthood often unfolded far from the court that once watched them. And in the quiet rhythm of convent life, the echoes of those early whispers slowly faded into silence. Thank you for spending this time wandering through the quieter corners of Tudor history. Stories like this remind us that history is not only made by kings and queens, but also by those whose lives unfolded just beyond the official record. For now, allow the noise of the court to fade, the whispers to grow distant, and the stone walls of the convent to settle into calm silence. Rest well, and may your night be peaceful. Good night.